The night shift began like any other. He stepped into the quiet streets of the downtown district, the faint hum of distant traffic blending with the occasional bark of a stray dog. The call had seemed routine enough. A noise complaint in a mid-rise apartment block. Nothing that had raised an eyebrow during his briefings. Keys jingled in his pocket, flashlight in hand, as he ascended the narrow staircase, each step echoing against the concrete walls. The air smelled faintly metallic, carried from somewhere deep in the building, and he shrugged it off as the lingering scent of the day's chaos. The lobby was dimly lit, fluorescent bulbs flickering in uneven intervals. The elevator doors groaned as they opened, revealing a long hallway that felt unusually empty. The apartment numbers were familiar, each door the same as the last patrol's, but something about the spacing seemed off. Distances stretched farther than they should have, corners bending subtly, just enough to unsettle. He shook his head and moved forward, telling himself his eyes were adjusting poorly to the low light. Voices carried from a distant apartment. A woman arguing with someone unseen, a man's muffled retorts. Normal sounds for a building of this age. Yet, when he paused, the arguing ceased, replaced by a whispering so faint he almost didn't hear it. It seemed to drift from somewhere just beyond reach, curling around the walls and brushing against his ears. He froze, straining to catch the words, but they were unintelligible, like the language of a dream half-remembered. The hallway stretched. Every door he passed appeared slightly farther apart than the one before. The polished metal of the fire alarm reflected his silhouette, but it lagged behind him, delayed, twisting in impossible angles. A cold draft wafted from the stairwell, carrying a faint metallic tang, and his breath puffed in small, visible clouds. The whispering persisted, never louder, never clearer, but insistent, as though it had purpose. He approached the apartment listed on the complaint. The door was closed, the nameplate intact, but the arguing had stopped entirely. The silence pressed in, heavy and unnatural, and he felt the hairs along his neck rise. For a moment, the faintest creak of movement echoed behind him, soft yet deliberate, like the shuffle of boots or claws across the tile floor. He turned sharply, flashlight sweeping the hallway, but found only empty doors and shadows that clung too closely to the walls. Each step forward felt heavier, as if the building itself resisted his progress. Hallways narrowed and lengthened in ways that shouldn't have been possible. Corners folding into angles that contradicted the structure he had memorized. The whispering circled him, teasing, brushing at his consciousness with a presence just out of reach. The elevator door at the far end of the hall gleamed like a promise of normality, yet it too seemed to stretch away, distant, unreachable. He paused again, listening. The argument had faded entirely, replaced now by a single, elongated breath echoing from the apartment above. The hairs on his arms prickled, and a cold sweat coated his back. Something was moving just beyond the reach of his vision, watching, waiting. The building was no longer merely walls and doors. It was something alive, aware of his intrusion. He gripped his flashlight tighter, stepping cautiously toward the door, aware that the faint whispers had not just followed him, they had guided him. By the time he reached the complaint's apartment, the normalcy of his night had vanished entirely. The door was still closed, the hallway still dim, yet he knew with a certainty that should have been impossible. Something had been here, moving behind him, shaping the space around him. He took a breath and turned the knob. The whispering intensified, curling around him, but the door yielded smoothly. Inside, the apartment was quiet, empty, ordinary, but the echoes in the hallway promised that what he had felt was far from over. The security monitors flickered faintly as he stepped into the control room, their dull green glow reflecting off the pale linoleum floor. At first, everything seemed routine. Static-filled images of empty hallways, vacant lobbies, and silent stairwells. He leaned closer to the screens, double-checking the timestamps against his own watch. But then he noticed it. Movement, subtle, almost imperceptible in the corner of a frame. A shadow detached itself from a wall, lingering just beyond the light of the hallway, vanishing whenever he shifted his gaze. He rubbed his eyes, convinced fatigue was playing tricks. Yet, as he toggled between cameras, the figures multiplied. Brief glimpses of shapes flitted past doorways, silhouettes that should have been impossible given the emptiness of the apartments. The reflections in the polished brass handrails seemed delayed, lagging behind him as he moved through the hallways. A door slammed softly somewhere above, echoing down corridors that had been silent seconds before. As he stepped back, a chill swept through the control room, the fluorescent bulbs flickering in uneven rhythm. He realized the shadows weren't just moving, they were tracking him. Each time he looked away, they shifted closer, creeping along walls and corners as if the building itself was breathing, alive with awareness. He forced himself to focus on the monitors, but even there, the shapes defied logic, bending around walls, stretching across hallways that couldn't exist in that configuration. He left the control room, flashlight in hand, moving cautiously down the hallway. The familiar doors seemed slightly skewed, frames misaligned, creating angles that should have been impossible. Every step he took echoed back at him from somewhere too distant, then too close. He paused at the midpoint of the corridor and glanced at his own reflection in the metal door plates. For an instant, the shadow didn't match his movement. It lingered behind him, stretching unnaturally, crouched just outside the periphery of his vision. A soft whisper carried from the far end, unintelligible but deliberate. It curled around the walls, brushing against his ears, teasing and taunting, and he felt a pull toward it, an instinctive urge to follow. His flashlight beam trembled as he approached a doorway. The shadows flickered, almost hiding in plain sight. He noticed subtle changes in the layout. Corridors slightly longer, stairwells bending where they shouldn't. The building was shaping itself around him, responding to his presence. He paused near a stairwell exit, the faint creak of movement echoing above. He looked up. The hall was empty, yet the sound continued, rhythmic, almost like footsteps pacing in tandem with his own. His stomach tightened, the metallic tang of something unseen filling the air. For the first time, he felt that he wasn't just in a building, but inside something aware, a structure observing him, reacting to him, guiding him. Back in the hallway, he tried to mark his position against familiar doorways, counting steps to reassure himself. But each hallway seemed to stretch differently than before, angles shifting imperceptibly as he turned. The shadows weren't confined to walls. They pooled in corners, hovering just above the floor, then dispersing, leaving nothing but the oppressive emptiness of the hall. When he glanced behind him, nothing was there, but the lingering sense of being watched persisted, heavy and suffocating. He reached a security camera mounted near the elevator and paused, studying the live feed. In the screen, just beyond the glare of his flashlight, a dark shape crouched in the corner, tall, thin, human-like, but impossibly distorted. He blinked, and it was gone. Yet, in the reflection of the metal stairwell railing, the same silhouette lingered for a heartbeat too long, tilting its head as if studying him. The whispering rose again, unintelligible but urgent, pulling him forward, deeper into hallways that should have led elsewhere. Every instinct screamed to leave, to find the exit he knew was just ahead, but the shadows continued their slow, deliberate approach. The building had become a maze, each corridor alive with movement, each reflection betraying figures that didn't exist. He pressed on, flashlight sweeping the walls, heart hammering, sensing not just a presence but multiple presences, waiting and watching. And though he saw nothing tangible, the proof lingered in the distorted shapes on the monitors and in the uneasy rhythm of the hallway, the undeniable creeping knowledge that he was no longer alone. The knock came when he wasn't expecting it, sharp and deliberate, echoing down a corridor that should have been empty. He froze, flashlight in hand, scanning the apartment numbers. The unit belonged to no one, a blank entry on the roster, yet the sound had been real, solid, undeniable. The hum of the building had changed, subtle at first. A low vibration that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. Corridors twisted slightly as he walked, angles bending in ways that made familiar turns feel foreign, like the building was stretching and folding just to observe him. He moved cautiously toward the door, each footstep echoing back in uneven rhythm. The floorboards creaked beneath him, though he remembered placing his feet carefully, counting each step. Something about the creaks felt wrong, deliberate, as if the building itself was signaling, marking him. Shadows gathered at the edges of the hallway, pooling and dissipating in patterns that made no sense. A faint metallic smell lingered in the air, sharp, almost electric, mingling with the ordinary scents of old carpets and cleaning fluid. He reached the apartment door and pressed an ear against it. Silence. A heartbeat passed. Then the faintest scuffing, like shoes dragged slowly along tile, echoed from behind, though he had already moved past the point it could have originated. He spun, sweeping the hallway with his flashlight, but found nothing. Just doors and walls, familiar and yet impossibly altered. Even the emergency exit sign above the stairwell seemed angled differently, teasing his perception. Every corridor he passed appeared to lengthen slightly, stretching out beyond reason, each doorway a doorway to uncertainty. A soft whisper brushed against his ears. He couldn't make out the words, but it carried a cadence that seemed deliberate, almost conversational. It threaded through the air like a melody only he could hear, rising and falling in rhythm with the building's creaks. The shadows flickered in the corner of his vision, shapes that bent and leaned impossibly, elongating along the walls as if the hallways themselves were alive. He realized then that the building wasn't just observing, it was responding, reacting to his presence, guiding him, shaping him into its pattern. He took another step toward the apartment, but the door had shifted slightly. Not open, not closed, just misaligned, leaning away from its frame in a way that defied mechanics. Each creak of the floor seemed synchronized with an echo of a previous step, repeating like a memory looping around him. He glanced back down the corridor. It appeared familiar, then subtly different. Familiar doors now slightly recessed, numbers out of order, lengths of hallways that should have ended much sooner, stretching indefinitely. The whispers grew more insistent, curling around his focus, teasing, directing him deeper. He tried to recall the layout of the building, the exact positions of stairwells, the elevator, the lobby, but nothing matched. Every step he took, the hallways shifted imperceptibly, as though the building were alive and breathing, reshaping itself with each motion. He passed the walls of other apartments, each seemingly ordinary, yet somehow wrong. Frames too tall, corners too sharp, shadows lingering just beyond the edges. When he finally reached the door, he hesitated, flashlight trembling in his hand. The air was thick, heavy with the metallic tang that had been growing since the beginning of the shift. Behind the door, he felt a presence, something both human and not, waiting. He pressed the knob, half expecting it to resist. It turned easily, yet the silence beyond felt unnatural, oppressive, as though the apartment were empty but aware. He stepped forward, heart pounding, senses screaming that he was no longer in a familiar building, that the city outside had slipped away and left him in a structure that lived and watched. A floorboard creaked somewhere far above, then again, in uneven sequence. Shadows twisted against the walls, and the whispering followed him, brushing over his skin like wind through hollow pipes. The apartment remained empty, the lights dim and ordinary, but the knowledge that the building itself had shifted, bent, and guided him here lingered in his mind. He realized that the knock had been a summons, that the hallways themselves were a maze, and that leaving would be far more complicated than simply walking out. Every instinct screamed to run, yet every hallway, every shadow, every whispered sound insisted he stay, that he had already crossed into a place he might never fully escape. The phone in his pocket vibrated sharply, cutting through the unnatural quiet of the hallway. He pulled it out, expecting a routine call or a dispatcher check-in, but froze when the screen displayed his own number. The line rang once, twice, and then a voice, his voice, spilled through the earpiece, repeating a phrase he didn't remember saying, a warning he didn't understand. Each syllable dripped with urgency, the words curling around the walls and echoing down corridors that seemed to twist farther than they should. He tried to shake it off, to call dispatch, but the line only hissed with static and warped echoes of his own breathing. Every turn he took, every step he made, the building seemed to respond. Hallways shifted subtly, angles bending and stretching, as if guiding him toward something unseen. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, briefly illuminating shadows that moved against the grain of the walls, only to vanish the moment he focused on them. He gripped the phone tighter, the cold sweat running down his neck as the whispers in the distance grew louder, harmonizing with the warped echo of his voice. Doors that should have been closed were ajar, and closed doors seemed to lean inward, creating angles that were wrong, uncomfortable, impossible. The subtle scent of metal hung heavy in the air, faint but distinct, clinging to the fluorescent hum that filled the building. He began to notice patterns, shadows repeating steps he hadn't taken yet, the hum of the building syncing with the rhythm of the call. As he advanced cautiously, a flicker on the monitors caught his attention. A dark figure moved just beyond the frame, crouching or kneeling, following him without sound. He swung the flashlight, but nothing appeared. Just the distorted hallways, doors slightly off kilter, and corners that seemed to stretch into darkness. The phone rang again, this time a long, drawn-out tone, the vibrating echo vibrating through his chest. When he answered, the voice repeated the same warning, softer now, almost coaxing, almost guiding. He tried to rationalize, telling himself it was a prank or some wiring issue, but logic felt thin here. The building itself had a rhythm, a pattern he couldn't decipher. Every step he took seemed preordained, as if the corridors themselves were alive enough to shape his path. Each turn brought him closer to the source of the echo, though he couldn't see it, couldn't understand it. Even the stairwell seemed to stretch downward endlessly, the fluorescent bulbs dimming in sequence with his heartbeat. He paused at the midpoint of a long corridor, listening to the repeating words of the phone. His own voice seemed layered, multiple versions overlapping, calling warnings from directions that didn't exist. The walls of the hallway, familiar a moment ago, now leaned inward slightly, pressing him forward, shaping the space. Shadows crept along corners just out of reach, as if tracing him, always aware, always just beyond the periphery of sight. In that moment, the building felt alive in a way that was almost conscious. It wasn't just a structure, it was a maze with intent, a vessel that carried voices, both real and impossibly distorted. The whispers on the phone intertwined with the building's hum, each vibration, each flicker of light, each subtle shift of walls and doors pulling him deeper. The corridors looped, stretching endlessly, until every direction seemed wrong, yet unavoidable. He realized, with a sinking weight, that the warning wasn't meant to inform, it was a guide, and he was being led somewhere. Somewhere he didn't want to go, yet every movement of the building insisted he continue. The echoes of his own voice merged with the shadows, pressing closer, and he felt the walls leaning, the hallway breathing, the floorboards groaning in unnatural sync. He could no longer tell where the building ended and where the threat began. The line between reality and the distorted echo of himself had collapsed entirely. And so he moved forward, guided by a voice that shouldn't exist, down hallways that had no right to be there, deeper into a structure that had become sentient, that had become something altogether alive and aware, waiting for him to cross the final threshold into the unknown. The hallways seemed to pulse as he moved, each step echoing back not as a reflection of sound, but as an extension of the building itself. Doors leaned slightly inward, corners stretched just beyond comprehension, and the fluorescent lights flickered in a rhythm that felt synchronized to his heartbeat. The air was heavier here, carrying a metallic tang, a subtle pressure that made it hard to take a deep breath. Every surface reflected more than light. It seemed to carry shadows that weren't entirely real, lingering at the edges of perception, just outside the reach of reason. Shadows lengthened unnaturally along the walls, creeping across ceilings, bending and stretching in ways that defied physics. A door closed softly behind him, though no breeze moved through the corridor. Another opened just wide enough for the dark to spill out, teasing him forward, daring him to enter. The building's hum had grown louder now, low and resonant, vibrating through the floor and through his chest. It was alive in the sense of observation, aware of him, responding to him, shaping the space to guide or trap him. The security monitors flickered, displaying images of figures just outside the range of the lights, too close to exist, too sharp to dismiss as trickery of shadows. He could see the shapes leaning in, elongated and thin, pressed close to the walls, their presence undeniable yet impossible. They moved with him, step for step, yet when he turned there was nothing. Each corridor seemed to expand and contract subtly enough that he only noticed when familiar doors were suddenly much farther down the hall, or when stairwells appeared longer than before. He felt the walls breathe, as if the building itself were inhaling and exhaling, shifting subtly in response to his movements. The floorboards groaned in sequence, sometimes repeating steps he hadn't yet taken. He realized he was navigating a living maze, one that had no concern for standard geometry or reality. Even the hallways he thought he knew twisted back on themselves, corners folding inward, doors appearing where none had existed moments ago. The whispers returned, low and layered now, weaving through the hum of the building. They weren't words he could understand, just tones and syllables, familiar yet wrong, echoing in multiple directions at once. The shadows on the walls sometimes seemed to lean toward him, stretching beyond their origin, pressing forward as if testing the limits of physical space. The air vibrated with the sensation of being watched from every corner simultaneously. Every exit he approached seemed farther away, receding subtly, as if the hallways were stretching with each step. His heart pounded with a growing dread, and yet there was an inexorable pull forward. The doors that should have led to safety now opened into corridors that felt wrong, too long, too narrow, too too dark. The sense of isolation intensified, as if the building had stripped him of his bearings, his knowledge of the world outside suspended. At one point he paused, pressed his back against a wall and tried to orient himself. The fluorescent lights above flickered once, twice, then stabilized, revealing shadows that had shifted closer, leaning just enough that he could feel their presence brushing against his peripheral vision. He could hear a soft scrape, like fingernails dragging along metal, though the surfaces around him were smooth and empty. Each breath he took seemed to carry the weight of the building pressing in from all sides, the walls almost resonating with his heartbeat, bending time and space in subtle, terrifying ways. The realization came slowly, suffocatingly. The hallways weren't just corridors, they were extensions of the building's consciousness. They moved, they observed, they guided. Exits no longer promised escape, and every path he thought he recognized warped beneath his feet. The figures on the monitors, the shadows in the corners, the shifting doors, they were all part of it. And he was trapped, moving forward through a space that lived, that breathed, that responded, into the unknown heart of a building that had become entirely, disturbingly sentient. Panic drove him forward, his boots striking the worn tiles with an urgency he had never known. Every corridor he turned into seemed familiar yet wrong, as if the building itself were rewriting its own architecture to trap him. He sprinted toward the street, retracing steps that should have been safe, that should have led him out, only to find the halls elongating, bending, folding in ways that made sense to no human eye. The exit signs flickered dimly, a weak reassurance in the oppressive darkness, but even they seemed to hesitate, stretching the distance between him and safety. Each apartment he passed was empty, sterile almost, with no trace of the residents he remembered seeing, or expecting to see. Furniture remained in perfect order, untouched, yet shadows lingered where none should be. Faces that had been behind windows and doors were gone entirely, leaving only the sensation that someone, or something, had withdrawn, watching him from a distance just beyond reach. The silence was heavy, the usual city hum replaced by a low vibration that seemed to emanate from the very walls, vibrating through the floor and into his chest. He glanced at a monitor tucked into a recessed hallway, a small relief in the maze of uncertainty. The feed flickered to life, revealing distorted shapes pressed against walls, stretching impossibly. Their forms too thin and too close to exist naturally. He jerked away, only to hear footsteps echo behind him, though when he turned, the hallways were empty. The air seemed thicker now, almost viscous, pressing against his skin, as if the building itself were breathing around him, guiding him, manipulating the space to ensure he could not escape. Every corner he rounded brought the same revelation. The residents were gone. Chairs sat upright, televisions hummed silently, and doors opened to reveal empty rooms. Yet, on the monitors, shadows moved in impossible ways, bending toward him, reaching from walls, floors, and ceilings. He could feel them in his peripheral vision, flickering just out of focus, impossible to confront directly. The building had swallowed the people he had once passed in the halls, leaving behind only echoes, only memories, and now him, alone and running. His own steps began to echo, but not in the natural rhythm of the hallway. Footfalls preceded him, lagged behind, and sometimes multiplied, as if he were surrounded by countless others, or perhaps himself. The hum of the fluorescent lights grew louder, resonating with the distorted shadows in the monitors, merging sound and sight into a sensory assault that threatened to collapse his mind. The walls themselves seemed to pulse, contracting and expanding subtly, guiding him toward the street but never delivering him fully, always keeping the end just out of reach. Every door he passed was either impossibly far away or too near, a cruel trick of the building's living geometry. He tried calling out, but his voice was swallowed by the low vibrations, bouncing back distorted and warped. His chest heaved, lungs burning, but the pull forward was relentless. Each corridor, each junction was a funnel, shaping him, bending him, ensuring that every movement brought him deeper into the building's impossible pattern. The monitors flickered again. Distorted shadows pressed against walls, their forms stretching, leaning, reaching, almost alive in the feed. They mirrored his fear, mimicked his movements, and multiplied with each step he took. The feeling of pursuit was overwhelming, an invisible weight pressing from every angle, closing in even when the hallways appeared empty. He ran blindly, each turn bringing him closer to the street, or at least to the illusion of it. Finally, a flicker of light from the exit sign offered hope. He sprinted toward it, adrenaline flooding every nerve, only to feel the floor shift beneath him subtly, the distance stretching once more. The shadows seemed to follow, pressing ever closer, reflected in every polished surface and monitor screen. He understood, with a terror that clawed at his sanity. The building was not just a place to escape from. It was aware, alive, and determined to leave him with the memory of its presence, its dominion, and the vanishing residents who had once walked these halls. The street outside appeared calm, the city lights steady, indifferent, as if nothing had happened within the walls he had just fled. He slowed, chest heaving, trying to make sense of the impossible labyrinth he had just navigated. The building loomed behind him, unchanged in appearance, ordinary in every architectural sense. But he knew better. Every step, every hallway, every shadow within those walls had been deliberate, aware, and impossibly sentient. He glanced back once, expecting to see movement, perhaps the residents returning, or shadows stretching from the windows. Nothing. The facade held no clue of the horror inside. It was ordinary, mundane, even comforting to the untrained eye. But the memory of the distorted security footage, of hallways breathing, of shadows pressing impossibly close, lingered like a pressure against his chest. He had escaped physically, yet the building's presence clung to him, a weight pressing at the edges of reality. Pulling the small, borrowed security monitor from his patrol bag, he checked the recordings. At first, the footage appeared normal. Empty apartments, flickering lights, the static hum of city life captured in grainy frames. But as he scrolled forward, shadows began to move with intent, pressing against walls, following corridors, twisting their shapes unnaturally to appear almost human yet impossibly elongated. They mirrored his panic, leaning closer in frames where the walls should have held nothing. Figures that weren't there when he had walked the hallways now reached toward the cameras, impossibly close, pressing into the very lenses that should have revealed only emptiness. The building had recorded him. It had mapped his movements, mirrored his fear, and captured it in the distorted reality of those shadows. Faces that had once belonged to residents had vanished entirely, replaced with silhouettes that defied explanation. He watched, stomach twisting, as one figure in particular seemed to linger near a corner he had passed repeatedly, bending in ways no human anatomy could allow. Its shadow stretching into the doorway, reaching as if to step out from the footage into his world. He tried to rationalize, to tell himself it was a trick of light, an artifact of the cameras, but the sequence was too precise, too deliberate. The building itself had curated a performance, a silent witness to its own unrelenting consciousness. Every door that had closed, every corridor that had elongated, every whisper that had brushed against his ears. It had all been part of an architecture designed to trap perception, to manipulate reality just enough to leave him questioning what was true. The phone in his pocket vibrated suddenly, an unwelcome reminder of the outside world. But when he looked, the screen displayed only static, the faint echo of his own voice whispering through the speaker, repeating phrases he could not understand. Each word matched the rhythm of the distorted hallways, the stretching corridors, the impossibly close shadows. It was as if the building had extended itself beyond its walls, reaching into the instruments he relied upon, ensuring that the experience could not be confined to memory alone. By now, he understood something fundamental. The residents weren't merely missing. They had been erased from normal reality, replaced in recordings and reflections with entities that existed solely to observe, to mimic, and to haunt. And though he had escaped into the street, though the city itself seemed oblivious, he felt their presence behind him, pressed into the edges of his vision, mirrored in every reflective surface he passed. The building had let him go, but it had left a mark, an imprint of the impossible, a reminder that he had walked through something alive, something that remembered every step he had taken. He took a deep breath and forced himself to move forward, the streetlights casting ordinary shadows that did not stretch, that did not lean or breathe. But behind him, in the recesses of memory and in the digital echoes of the monitors, the building remained. It was patient, it was waiting, and it knew he would never forget the way it had reached for him, folded reality around him, and recorded his terror for eternity. The last images on the monitor lingered on his mind. Shadows pressing against walls, leaning impossibly, a silent audience to his flight. He would tell himself it was over, that he had escaped. But the building's secret remained, an unresolved presence, a question mark etched into the very fabric of his perception. And he knew, deep down, that the building was still alive, still watching, and would never truly let him go. The warehouse loomed at the edge of town, its walls sagging and shadowed under the weak glow of a flickering streetlight. The officer parked his cruiser, stepping out into the cold air that smelled faintly of rust and decay. Inside, the dust hung thick, settling over crates and forgotten machinery like a living weight. Each footstep he took echoed strangely, bouncing in directions that made no sense, whispering that he was not alone. A faint chill brushed the back of his neck as the door creaked closed behind him, and the silence seemed to stretch, patient, watching. The fluorescent lights buzzed, flickering, casting the corners of the warehouse into intermittent darkness. Shapes crouched in the shadows, vanishing the instant he turned his head. Soft murmurs came from the walls, voices repeating things he had never said, names he did not know. His own steps felt mirrored, echoing in patterns he could not follow. Then he saw them, footprints appearing behind him where he had never walked, sharp and deliberate, as if the building itself had left a record of his movements. He rounded a corner and caught a fleeting silhouette, crouched low and human-like, yet wrong. When he blinked, it had vanished, leaving only a shadow deeper than the surrounding darkness. The air thickened, swallowing sound, and the faintest whispers grew urgent, repeating names and times with uncanny precision. Every instinct told him he was being watched, eyes tracking him from angles he could not see. And yet, when he spun around, nothing moved except for the air, heavy and waiting. A muffled scream vibrated through the floorboards, low and urgent, as though trapped beneath the concrete. Hands pressed against the walls, pale and wet with shadows, disappearing the instant he lunged toward them. He recoiled, chest tightening, unsure if what he had seen was real or a trick of the mind. The corridors twisted back on themselves, leading him in loops that seemed impossible. Every turn brought him back to the same spot, the warehouse stretching and bending around him, aware of his presence. The radio at his belt crackled to life, spitting words he had never spoken. Threats and warnings overlapped conversations from hours ago, as if time itself had folded into the static. Names, dates, and times repeated like a looped memory, overlapping with calls he had yet to receive. He moved toward the nearest exit, but the warehouse refused him. Every door opened into another empty room, each one smaller, darker, more alive than the last. The building was speaking, recording, remembering. He ran down a hallway, following a door that promised escape, only to find another identical corridor beyond it. The walls seemed to breathe, stretching and bending as though mocking his every step. Light flickered overhead, revealing brief glimpses of figures pressed against surfaces, flattened and watching. Panic rose, raw and heavy, as dawn began to seep through high windows. The exit he had hoped for slid farther away, as if the warehouse itself were a living labyrinth, unwilling to let him leave. He collapsed outside, the first sunlight staining the horizon pale and cold. The warehouse appeared dormant, silent and empty, as if nothing had happened, but the radio at his side whispered still, distorted voices recounting events of the night with chilling clarity. Names, commands, warnings. It was alive in memory, recording each movement he had made. He sat on the cracked asphalt, breath ragged, unsure whether the terror had ended or if it was waiting, patient, for him to return. The fluorescent lights flickered, throwing corners of the warehouse into deep, uneven shadows. Shapes lingered just beyond sight, crouched low, disappearing the moment he tried to focus. A chill crept along his spine, subtle at first, then insistent, as if the air itself had teeth. Soft murmurs came from the walls, voices repeating words he had never spoken, names he did not recognize. They seemed to echo with memory, yet belonged to no one present. Every step he took felt mirrored, almost anticipating him. Each footfall recorded and returned in echoing patterns that made his skin crawl. He paused, noticing something impossible. Footprints appearing behind him where he had never walked. They pressed into the dust as if someone, or something, was tracking his every movement. The emptiness of the hall amplified each sound, the faintest creak or shift in air becoming a warning. He tried to rationalize it, to remind himself the warehouse was old and unstable, but instinct screamed that this building remembered him, that it had waited for him in the dark. Every shadow became a question, every flicker a signal, and the murmurs continued, patient, pressing, as if the walls themselves were alive. He rounded another corner, and for a heartbeat, a crouched silhouette flickered at the edge of his vision. Unnervingly human, yet impossibly wrong. When he blinked, it vanished, swallowed by the thickening darkness that seemed to absorb sound as well as light. The air felt heavier here, charged with something unseen, and the faintest whispers pressed against his ears, repeating names and times with an unsettling accuracy that made his stomach knot. Every instinct screamed that eyes were tracking him from angles he could not see, following each step as though the shadows themselves had intelligence. He spun around, heart hammering, but the hall remained empty, silent except for the low echo of his own movements, and a rising, unbearable sense that he was not walking through the warehouse alone. A muffled scream reverberated through the floorboards, low and raw, as though trapped just beneath the concrete itself. He froze, chest tightening. as pale hands pressed outward from the walls for the briefest fraction of a second before vanishing into solid surface. The air grew colder, heavier, each breath fogging slightly as if the building exhaled with him. Corridors looped and twisted in ways that made no sense, each turn returning him to the same spot, the same faint footprints trailing behind him where he had never walked. Every instinct screamed that the warehouse was alive, bending and folding around him, recording his presence and waiting for him to make a mistake he could never undo. The radio at his belt crackled to life, spitting words he had never spoken. The static hissed and popped, but underneath he could hear fragments of conversations, commands, names, warnings, overlapping with events from hours ago and some that hadn't happened yet. Distorted voices repeated times and dates with impossible precision, layering over each other like a memory stuck on loop. He moved toward the nearest exit, but the warehouse refused him. Every door opened into another empty room, smaller, darker, and more oppressive than the last. The walls seemed to pulse faintly with each heartbeat, the air thick with anticipation, and he realized with a growing dread that the building was not just observing him. It was speaking, recording, and remembering every movement he made. He ran down a hallway, chasing a door he was certain led outside, only to find himself stepping into another identical corridor. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting as if mocking his every move. Light flickered overhead, casting brief reflections of figures pressed flat against the surfaces, watching, waiting. Each turn brought him no closer to escape. The hallways twisted and stretched in impossible ways, bending reality around him. Panic coiled tight in his chest as the first pale hints of dawn seeped through high windows, yet the exit continued to retreat, always just beyond reach, leaving him trapped in the warehouse's living labyrinth, aware that it was as patient as it was alive. He collapsed onto the cracked asphalt outside, the first pale light of dawn stretching across the horizon. The warehouse sat dormant and silent, its sagging walls motionless, as if the night had never happened. But the radio at his side whispered still, voices distorted and warped, recounting every movement, every choice he had made inside. Names, commands, warnings, they repeated over and over, like the building had recorded the night and stored it alive. He sat in silence, lungs burning, mind fraying, unable to tell which moments had been real and which had belonged to the warehouse itself. The terror lingered in the soft morning light, patient, waiting for him to return, for another night to unfold. The night settled over the city like a thick, wet blanket, the streets empty and humming with the faint resonance of distant traffic. Inside the dispatch office, the fluorescent lights flickered just enough to make the shadows of the equipment twitch against the walls. He had walked these halls 100 times before, each graveyard shift routine and predictable, a rhythm of ringing phones and the quiet hum of monitors keeping track of lives moving far above him. It was the kind of calm that lulled a person into forgetting how long the hours stretched, how quiet the world could feel when it was stripped of everyone else. At first, it was nothing. A crackle, faint and thin, cutting through the usual chatter of the radios. It sounded like interference, static layered over static, a hiss that might have been dismissed if not for the subtle hints of voices underneath. Low murmurs, almost human, threading together words he couldn't quite catch. For a moment, he leaned back in his chair and rubbed his eyes, telling himself the night had just made him more sensitive, that the hum of machinery sometimes generated patterns that seemed almost alive. But the patterns grew sharper. The murmurs coalesced into syllables, then fragments of phrases, like echoes of conversations he should not have been privy to. It wasn't anyone he knew, at least, not yet. Yet the timbre of the voices carried a familiarity that gnawed at the edges of his mind, tugging at memory with the weight of something half-remembered and impossible to place. He adjusted the dial, checked the connections, tapped the equipment. The static flared in response, almost as if it were aware of his attempts to control it, a restless pulse beneath the surface of the night. He told himself it was nothing. Just an anomaly, a misfire, maybe a prank signal bouncing off some distant repeater. Still, there was that subtle mimicry, the rhythm of the voices occasionally matching the cadence of his own speech, a strange echo of the way he spoke into the microphone. He froze, the air suddenly colder. The office no longer a sanctuary but a cage. Even the hum of the monitors seemed distorted, ringing a note that didn't belong, vibrating in his chest more than in his ears. Then came the first sharp crackle. Not a distant hiss, not a murmured echo. This one burst through the silence, a jagged electric slash that made him flinch. The console blinked as though the pulse had passed through it, and for a moment the world tilted. The office, the equipment, the glowing panels, it all seemed too quiet, stretched, waiting. He leaned closer to the screen, trying to tell himself it was still nothing more than interference, but the sense of being observed had already settled over him, a pressing weight that pressed against the back of his neck and settled in the pit of his stomach. He noticed then that the static wasn't random. It pulsed, shifted, and for brief fragments of time. He could swear he heard a name, his name, folding through the hissing white noise. He jerked back, heart racing, scanning the office as if expecting something to emerge from behind the walls. The monitors blinked and flickered, displaying nothing unusual, yet the crackle remained, bouncing between speakers, between the walls, echoing in corners where shadows pooled. It carried a rhythm, a cadence that was unnervingly human, almost deliberate, as though the noise itself were reaching out to him, testing the boundaries of what could be heard. Minutes stretched and thickened. Every glance at the consoles made him aware of slight anomalies, a screen flickering faster than it should, a speaker vibrating without reason, a light stuttering as if someone, or something, were breathing against the machinery. The hum of the building and the electrical thrumming of the radios merged with the static, forming a sound that seemed alive, aware. His own movements seemed to echo, reflected in the hiss in a delayed, distorted mimicry. By 2:47 a.m., he realized he no longer trusted the office, no longer trusted the machines, and certainly no longer trusted his own ears. The static had learned his voice, and he knew, with a kind of creeping certainty, that it was waiting, listening. Each crackle now was not a sound but an invitation, a lure into something just beyond comprehension. He leaned forward, heart hammering, staring at the blinking console, and in the midst of the persistent hiss, he thought he heard a whisper, low, urgent, unmistakably clear, saying his name. The lights blinked again, the monitors hummed in unison, and the night seemed to hold its breath. He remained there, frozen, aware that something had arrived with the static, something that had been patient, hidden in the hum, waiting for him to notice. And, as the crackle split the silence once more, he understood that the graveyard shift had begun in earnest, and that nothing about this night would be routine. The static had settled into a rhythm now, no longer just background noise but a presence, curling around the office like smoke that shouldn't be there. Calls began to arrive, each one slicing through the low hum with a sharp, distorted edge. At first, it was the usual mixture of traffic concerns and minor disturbances, the kind of reports that could be filed and forgotten by morning. But then the voices changed, warped, garbled, impossible. Each call carried a frantic, stuttering rhythm. cries that seemed human but stretched, smeared across the frequency until they became something else entirely, something that clawed at the edges of comprehension. He listened, his hands hovering over the console trying to trace the origin, to make sense of the madness. But the details were wrong, impossibly wrong. A report of a burglary in a street that didn't exist. A car accident described with precision on a road he knew had been closed for months. Then, just when he thought he might dismiss it, a voice named a crime so personal it rooted him to the chair. A theft that had occurred years ago in his own neighborhood, an event he had never mentioned to anyone, recounted with chilling clarity. The air grew colder. The fluorescent lights above him dimmed and hummed, as though in response to the sounds. Each static-laden transmission seemed to probe him, testing boundaries, adjusting to his reactions. He tried writing notes, marking the times, scribbling down numbers and addresses, anything to impose order on the chaos. But every attempt to anchor reality was met with something subtle yet unmistakable. The cries looping in patterns that mirrored his own pulse, the static swelling when he took a breath, the digital clock on the wall blinking with a stutter that made the seconds feel heavier, drawn, measured. One call came that made him freeze completely. The voice, shrill and trembling beneath the static, referenced a minor incident from his childhood. A scraped knee, a lost bicycle, the exact day, the exact time. He hadn't told anyone, not his spouse, not his parents, not a single friend. The memory it evoked surged through him, mixing with the rising panic in a way that made the office feel impossibly small, the walls pressing closer with each beep of the console. He realized then that this wasn't interference, this wasn't a prank. It was intimate. The voices knew things, details of his life that had never been spoken, facts no one else could have known. As the shift deepened, the static itself seemed to thicken, rolling across the office in waves. The calls multiplied, overlapping in layers that made direction and origin impossible to track. It became a chorus of accusation and familiarity, of names and events that shouldn't exist in this space, this time. He caught fragments of conversations never had, arguments he never participated in, warnings he never received. The walls seemed to pulse faintly with the rhythm, every hum and flicker in the lights aligning with the cadence of the voices, until the office was no longer a room, but a resonant chamber of memory and impossibility. He tried speaking into the microphone, hoping to call out, to break the cycle, but each word returned distorted, twisted through the static, sounding almost like pleading, almost like someone else. His own voice became an instrument, a conduit for the chaos, confirming what he already feared. He was not merely observing this, he was part of it, folded into it, inseparable. Every attempt to call for backup failed. The system would not connect to anyone else. Each beep of a line opening, each crackle, became a reminder that he was alone, and yet saturated with presence, haunted by echoes that had no origin. Time stretched. The ordinary rhythm of the office, the hum of monitors, the occasional ring of an actual call, was swallowed beneath the layering static. He noticed that the monitors began to flicker with faint, ghostly images of officers at calls he knew had never occurred. The faces were indistinct, shrouded in gray fuzz and digital interference, but the movements were precise, human, disturbingly real. He leaned forward, heart hammering, realizing that the voices and images were synchronized, rehearsed even, as though the static itself contained memory he could not control, cannot escape. By 3:14 a.m., he understood the depth of what he faced. The static was no longer random, it was deliberate, intimate, targeting him, wrapping around his consciousness like a net. exposing him to histories that never happened and crimes that had never been committed. Each call, each distorted word, pressed further into him, folding past and present together until he was certain of only one thing. The voices shouldn't exist, and yet they did, lingering, circling the room, patient, waiting for him to notice the next layer of impossibility. The shift had settled into a strange, tense rhythm, the kind that made seconds feel like minutes and minutes stretch into hours. Then it happened. A call that cut through the static with startling clarity, a voice so precise it made him flinch. It said his spouse's name, then his children's, soft but deliberate, as though each syllable had been carved from memory. His stomach dropped, an icy weight pressing down as he tried to tell himself it was coincidence, a trick of the radio, but the panic simmered at the edges. The events it recounted were intimate, impossibly specific. Conversations he never had, arguments that existed only in his mind, memories of moments he had kept private. The radio wasn't just repeating noises anymore. It was showing him pieces of a life he had never exposed. The monitors flickered in tandem, ghostly shapes of officers appearing mid-response to calls that had never happened, their figures blurry, movements deliberate, eyes staring past the screen as though into something beyond the office walls. He leaned closer, heart thudding, convinced for a moment that someone, something, was on the other side, watching, waiting to see how he would react. Each time he shifted, the static seemed to warp, rising in pitch, layering voices and patterns that mimicked his own breathing. The ordinary hum of computers and fluorescent lights had vanished, replaced with the relentless, looping presence of calls and murmurs that should not exist. He reached for the keyboard, trying to type notes, to log the names, to anchor reality in something tangible, but the letters danced on the screen, rearranging themselves into phrases he hadn't typed, sentences that described things he hadn't done. His pulse hit a frantic rhythm, echoing through his ears, mingling with the static, until he could no longer tell if the sound was coming from the office or from inside his own head. Every instinct screamed to leave, to run from the monitors, from the phones, from the voices that now seemed to respond to his slightest movement. Yet his legs remained locked, his fingers frozen above the console, caught in the gravity of their impossible knowledge. Another call came, lower, rasping, almost mournful, naming events from his past that he had buried so deeply he had almost forgotten them. He tried to speak, to respond, but the words were swallowed by interference, replaced by distorted versions of his own voice repeating the same names over and over. It was as if the static had learned him, mirrored him, and now used his own identity as a key to pry open the room, the shift, his very mind. The hum of the fluorescent lights stuttered and dimmed, shadows flickering across the walls like fingers reaching through cracks, trying to touch, to pull, to merge with him. The longer he sat, the more he noticed subtle, impossible things. Reflections in the monitors showed figures behind him that disappeared when he turned. The clocks on the walls lost rhythm, their seconds stretching unevenly. Each tick a note in a maddening symphony that matched the cadence of the voices. He began to realize that these calls were not random. They were tracing him, threading through his life, touching the hidden corners, the quiet fears, the private moments. They were intimate, relentless, omnipresent. Each ring, each click, each whisper of static was another piece of a puzzle designed to unsettle, to fragment his sense of time and self. By 4:03 a.m., he understood that the office was no longer a workplace, no longer a place governed by the rules of reality. It had become a conduit, a chamber where past and present collided, where private histories could be summoned and replayed at the mercy of voices that should not exist. Every call pressed closer, closer to his memory, closer to his perception, until he could no longer separate what had happened from what was happening now. His breathing matched the static, his heartbeat became the rhythm of the office, and in that fusion, he realized the terrifying truth. The calls had found him, and whatever haunted this night shift was patient, precise, and far beyond his control. The whispering names lingered, echoing in the silence between calls, crawling over the monitors, seeping into the fluorescent flicker and into him. He sat frozen, aware that the voices were no longer just on the line. They were inside, folding reality around him, showing him a life that was both his and not, and there was no escaping what they would reveal next. The office phone rang from its usual spot on the desk, but something about the tone made his stomach knot. He had checked every line. This one shouldn't have been active. When he lifted the receiver, a low, dragging voice began counting, each number slow, deliberate, curling through the room like smoke. 1, 2, 3. Each second stretched longer than it should have, the digits filling the space, embedding themselves into the hum of the monitors, seeping into his ears until he could barely distinguish the static from the countdown itself. He tried to place the call on hold, tried to hang up, but the line remained stubbornly alive, relentless, as if the phone itself were aware of his presence, aware of his fear. The numbers were wrong in more ways than one. They weren't just counting down. They were marking time he didn't understand, time that seemed to bend around him. He glanced at the monitors. Frozen frames glared back. Images of officers mid-response to calls that had never been made, the ghosts of duties that had never existed. Each flicker of the screen synchronized with the counting, their light pulsing in rhythm with his thudding heartbeat. He pressed keys, attempted to mute, to silence, but the system resisted, glitching, distorting, collapsing under the weight of an impossible logic. The numbers stretched further, slower, the air thickening with every drawn-out 7, 8, as if the room itself were drawing breath in tandem with the voice. Then came the first true disruption. The fluorescent lights stuttered violently, buzzing a note sharp enough to make his skin crawl. Shadows shifted unnaturally across the office walls, elongating, curling, retreating and advancing in the same moment. The static that had once been distant now wrapped around him, swirling in the low hum of machines and the dragging voice counting down a time he could not measure. He felt the monitors tremble beneath his fingertips, and with each freeze frame, images bled into one another. Doors opening and closing, officers standing in empty corridors, phones lifting themselves from desks as if unseen hands were testing the limits of the room. Panic surged. He dropped the receiver for a moment, the line still alive, the countdown continuing without pause. Numbers echoed in his skull, a drumbeat of dread that synchronized with the flickering monitors and the rhythmic hum of the fluorescent bulbs. A chilling thought coiled in his chest. It wasn't just a countdown to 0. It was a countdown to something beyond comprehension. A sequence timed to his own pulse, his own awareness. The office, the equipment, the very air seemed to respond to the cadence, shifting imperceptibly closer, tightening around him as if reality were folding in to accommodate the voice. He gripped the receiver again, fingers trembling, trying to speak, to call for help, but his words were absorbed into the static, returned as distorted fragments, broken pleas, and half-formed sentences that sounded like his own voice begging to escape. He watched numbers stretch beyond reason, while the monitors projected impossible scenes, hallways looping back on themselves, corridors that shouldn't exist, figures that appeared and vanished in the same breath. The line counted on, unyielding, dragging seconds into minutes, and the office ceased to feel familiar, familiar being a word that now belonged to another life. As the countdown neared 0, all systems began to fail simultaneously. Monitors froze mid-flash, lights cut out entirely, leaving the room in a suffocating, oppressive darkness. The hum of machines died, leaving only the dragging voice, long and resonant, filling every corner, every shadow. The silence that followed was not relief. It was an absence, a void that pressed against his eardrums and his chest. In that blackness, he realized he could hear something else. A whisper, faint but precise, repeating his name again and again, as if the room itself had learned to speak him into existence. He dared not move, dared not breathe too loudly, knowing that whatever had been counting down had not ended. It had merely shifted, leaving him alone with the echoes, the static, and a dread that would not fade. The darkness lingered longer than it should have, swallowing the office in an oppressive stillness that pressed against his ears and chest. The monitors remained blank, the phones dead, the hum of computers absent, yet the space was not empty. A faint, deliberate whisper drifted from somewhere between the walls and the ceiling, curling around his head, repeating his name in a tone that was intimate, yet alien. He froze, realizing that the room itself seemed aware of his presence, aware of every small movement, every shallow breath. Even the silence carried weight, a presence pressing against him, reminding him that something had not left, had never left. He inched toward the door, heart hammering, each step unnervingly loud in the quiet, echoing back at him from unseen corners. The air felt thick, almost viscous, clinging to his skin, and with every forward movement the whispering grew stronger, weaving around his senses, making it impossible to tell where the sound began and where it ended. He reached for the handle, but the cold metal seemed different somehow, heavier, almost resistant, as if the room itself had extended its grip. He tried the phones again, tried the radios, but they remained dead, silent witnesses to whatever had taken root inside the office. The more he strained to listen, the more he became aware of other subtleties. Shadows shifted in impossible ways, bending around corners and against walls, moving just outside his direct vision. The fluorescent lights flickered sporadically, each pulse revealing fragments of shapes that vanished the moment he looked directly at them. It was as though the room itself had learned to mimic his attention, to hide and reveal at will, to tease him with impossible glimpses of something waiting, something patient. The whispering continued, each repetition of his name dragging longer and deeper into his mind, pressing on memories he would rather forget, threading into his awareness with unnerving precision. He backed away from the door, uncertain if leaving would break the spell or worsen it. The weight of the room seemed to intensify, pressing down, crowding him from all sides. Every object felt significant now, every chair, every fallen paper, every idle monitor seemed imbued with intent, waiting, observing. He caught movement in the corner of his eye, a fleeting shimmer that could have been nothing, but his instincts screamed otherwise. The whisper repeated, patient and methodical, until he could no longer distinguish between sound and thought, between memory and the present. The sense of being watched grew unbearable. He realized he was not alone, not in the traditional sense. Something lingered in the space between reality and perception, a presence that bent the laws of the office around it. It did not need to speak loudly, the silence itself communicated, shaping his fear with the subtlest currents of sound, the smallest flickers of light, the almost imperceptible movements around him. He tried to call out, tried to summon help, but the silence absorbed it all, returning only that steady, patient repetition of his name. It was intimate, accusatory, and precise, confirming that however unseen this entity or these entities might be, they knew him, and they had waited. Time became meaningless. He could not tell if seconds had passed or hours. Each moment stretched and folded back into itself, the whisper echoing, the shadows shifting, the office breathing around him. He realized that the silence was not absence. It was presence, a living memory of sound and shadow, waiting to see how he would respond, to test his endurance, to remind him that leaving might not end the observation. With every step, every blink, he felt the room remembering him, cataloging his fear, mapping his reactions as if the office itself had become an organism, patient, sentient, and entirely indifferent to the laws of reason. He stayed pressed against the wall, heart hammering, trying to steady his breath, knowing that the whispering would not stop, that silence was never empty. It was waiting. By the time backup arrived, the office had transformed into a space that no longer resembled the one he had entered hours before. Computers were charred and twisted, monitors shattered, wires looped and knotted as if pulled by invisible hands. Yet, despite the destruction, something remained intact, almost impossibly so. The digital files perfectly preserved, each folder labeled with dates stretching years into the future. He stared at them on a borrowed machine, fingers trembling, realizing that the voices he had heard, the cries, the names, the impossible calls, had left traces, records that existed beyond the physical limits of the equipment that had birthed them. He tried to explain it to the officers, but words failed. The machines were dead, unresponsive, yet the files persisted, humming with static that seemed almost alive. Tiny pulses vibrating through the keyboard as if the system were aware of his touch. Each recording contained the same indistinct mixture of sounds, garbled voices, faint screams, counting, and static that twisted into intelligible fragments just long enough to remind him that what he had experienced had not been imagined. Dates that should not exist, conversations that had not yet happened, names that had no origin. Each file was a reminder that the events of the shift had left a footprint beyond time, a presence unconstrained by the physical world. He watched as officers gingerly inspected the office, moving over broken monitors and scorched cables, but their curiosity could not touch what he now knew to be permanent. He opened one file, hearing fragments of the static call his name, echoing in his skull, as if it had followed him through every step of the building. The lines between memory and recording blurred. He could not tell if the cries were in the file or in his mind. Each playthrough revealed more. Additional voices, new events described in detail he had not witnessed, each one layered over the remnants of the destroyed equipment, building a narrative that should not have existed, yet somehow did. Time had lost its meaning. The shift that had once been a sequence of hours now stretched indefinitely, anchored only by the recordings that seemed to anticipate future moments. He realized that the office had not just been a conduit for static and distorted calls. It had been a vessel, a place where sound and memory and reality folded into one another. The physical destruction of computers and lines did nothing to erase what had occurred. In fact, it seemed to amplify it, leaving behind a record that no human hand could undo. He tried to rationalize it. Perhaps corrupted systems, prank calls, his own frayed nerves, but the files were too precise, too deliberate, containing references only he could understand. Names of relatives, events from childhood, conversations he had never had, calls he never answered yet recorded as though he had. The weight of realization pressed down on him, heavier than any fear from the shift itself. These voices, these recordings were not bound by machinery. They existed independently, continuing without him, without time, beyond the reach of anything ordinary. As the officers packed up the last of the equipment, he lingered near the intact folders, a cold dread crawling up his spine. The static whispered faintly through speakers long dead, a reminder that what had been recorded was not a memory, but an extension of the phenomenon itself. It had survived destruction, distance, and time, waiting patiently for someone to notice, for someone to acknowledge that the office, the shift, the calls, they were not confined to a single night. He felt the presence again, close enough to brush his awareness, insidious and patient, as if it had been observing him throughout the cleanup, cataloging his reactions just as meticulously as it had cataloged its own impossible recordings. He stepped away, heart still racing, knowing that leaving the office would not end it. The recordings remained. Beyond machines, beyond walls, beyond reason, they persisted. Somewhere, in the static and the silence, the voices continued, naming, counting, describing events that had yet to occur. And he understood, in the deepest part of himself, that the shift was never over, that the phenomena would outlast him, outlast any human witness, continuing in the quiet, waiting for the next listener to press play. Even after the shift ended, the static remained. He thought leaving the office would sever whatever had reached through that line of sight, through those speakers, through those monitors, but the whispers followed him, threading into the silence of his apartment, the hum of his car, the quietest corners of his mind. Names, events, cries that should have belonged to someone else played over and over, indistinguishable from reality, yet impossibly distorted. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard the faint crackle of a line connecting him back to the office, a pulse of sound that never existed in the physical world, and he realized the shift had never truly ended. He tried to convince himself it was hallucination, stress, fatigue, anything to rationalize the way a voice could call his name, so precise and personal it left his chest hollow and cold. But the recordings remained. He had copied them onto every device he owned, desperate to examine them, to understand, to find a pattern, but each playthrough revealed more than before. The static shifted, layering new voices, recounting actions he hadn't yet taken, recounting conversations he hadn't yet had. It was as if the phenomenon anticipated his life, folding his present into a narrative that was not entirely his own, a timeline that did not respect logic or causality. He noticed that familiar sounds had begun creeping into ordinary spaces, the faint crackle when he flipped a light switch, the rhythmic hum of a fan carrying undercurrents of distorted speech, the subtle repetition of phrases he had never spoken. They were not merely recordings now, they had become a living presence, a conduit of something outside time, impervious to the physical limits of machines. Each new whisper was insistent, layering itself over his memory, reconfiguring the ordinary into something uncanny. Even when he spoke aloud, testing himself, asking questions, the replies seemed to come not from any other human, but from the same unseen system that had haunted the office, slightly ahead, slightly behind, always echoing, always anticipating. Sleep became impossible. Each night, he would close his eyes only to hear fragments of the shift, the calls, the distorted cries, the countdowns, the names of people long gone or never known, threaded into his thoughts with precision he could not explain. Every attempt to escape, to leave the house, to block the sound, failed. Even in the street, passing cars seemed to hum with static. Passing strangers' voices warped, recounting parts of his life he had never shared. The calls had followed him, had expanded, grown, and evolved beyond any human attempt at containment. He began to understand the truth he had been too terrified to accept. The office had been only the beginning, a conduit, a vessel for something that outlasted time, that bled into consciousness itself. The recordings were permanent, but they were not inert. They were active, listening, anticipating, cataloging, connecting. Names, events, and cries echoed inside his mind indistinguishably from reality, impossible to ignore. Even if he destroyed every physical medium, every device, the phenomenon would persist, continuing on its own terms. The calls had no origin he could trace, no end point he could reach. They were a current, a tide that carried everything he knew into something larger, something unknowable. He realized he was trapped in a cycle of dread, a liminal space between past, present, and the events yet to occur. The voices were not just memories. They were a record, a warning, a living archive that had outlived the machines that carried them, existing now in the quietest spaces, the background hum of life, the pause between one breath and the next. The static whispered his name again, close and intimate, folding the world into its rhythm, reminding him that it would never stop. It could not stop. He understood that he was now part of the archive, catalogued alongside events yet to happen, trapped in an endless loop of sound and memory, a witness to a shift that stretched beyond time itself. And so he remained, listening, counting, waiting, knowing that somewhere the calls continued, echoing into futures that had not yet arrived, that the cycle was eternal, that the office had never truly been a location but a threshold. The recordings persisted, and the voices never ended. The night had been quiet in the way only rural highways could be. Just the hum of the engine, the steady rhythm of tires on worn asphalt, and the low glow of the dashboard clock slipping toward 12:43 a.m. Mile marker 12 rose out of the darkness like any other, a reflective green sign half swallowed by overgrown brush. I barely glanced at it. I'd passed this stretch 100 times. It was just road, just routine, nothing more. But the fog was wrong. It didn't roll in the way fog normally did. It waited, a dense, unmoving wall that clung to the asphalt as though the air itself had curdled. I slowed instinctively, leaning forward to see where the beam of the headlights vanished in a chalk-white haze. Locals always muttered about this area, said the fog here had a memory. I'd laughed it off for years. That night, I didn't laugh. A lone sedan drifted into view ahead of me, barely visible before it slipped into the thickest part of the fog bank. Its taillights glowed once, two faint red coals suspended in milk, and then simply went out. No brake flash, no swerve, no silhouette, just gone. I waited for the sound, metal hitting ditch, tires chewing gravel, anything that said the driver had misjudged the curve. But silence spread out instead, heavy and total, like a blanket pressed over the world. I eased forward, expecting bent steel or shattered glass to materialize in front of me. But all I found was empty road. No skid marks, no debris, no tire tracks leading off into the brush. Just the fog breathing around my cruiser, thick enough to smother the headlight beams into pale halos. I stepped out, the air cold enough to sting my lungs. The silence had weight to it, the kind that made every small sound, my boots on the pavement, the faint creak of cooling metal, echo far louder than they should. I walked a few yards into the void, calling out once, twice, knowing no one would answer. That's when I heard it. Behind me, the fog shifted, not a breeze, not a rustle, but movement. Something pushing the air aside with slow intention. I turned, expecting an animal, a stray branch, anything that made sense. but the fog behind my cruiser swirled as though something had just slipped out of sight, leaving only the faint trail of disturbed vapor fading like breath on cold glass. I told myself I imagined it, but the fog didn't settle. It hovered, waiting, as if something still stood there, just beyond where the light could reach. The drive should have felt familiar after all these years. Yet, the farther I moved past mile marker 12, the more the night seemed to thicken around the cruiser, as if the world were drawing breath and holding it. I kept waiting for the road to steady into something ordinary again, but the fog only pressed tighter, thinning just enough for the high beams to carve out a pale tunnel ahead. And that was when I saw them, shapes standing dead center on the asphalt, still as stripped trees, their outlines too straight and too narrow to be human, yet arranged exactly like people facing the oncoming lights. I eased forward, pulse tapping at the inside of my throat, watching the silhouettes remain perfectly motionless until the beams stretched long enough to reach their feet. Then each figure thinned, warped, and slipped sideways into the fog, not walking, not turning, but dissolving as though the air had swallowed them whole. I rolled over the spot where they'd stood, heart thudding, only to see a fresh set of skid marks scoring the pavement, brake lines identical to the cruiser's own pattern, but smeared and recent, as if I had already stopped hard on that same stretch moments before. Before I could make sense of it, the radio crackled to life on its own, the dial unmoved, the switch untouched, filling the cabin with a soft clicking that wasn't quite static and wasn't quite speech. Then, threaded through the noise like a whisper pressed right against my ear, I heard a voice murmur my badge number, slowly, precisely, and with the quiet certainty of something that had been waiting for me in the dark. I cycled through the radio frequencies, hoping the whisper was just interference, but every channel bled with the same broken chorus, fragments of old distress calls, clipped breaths, the thin edges of voices I recognized from missing persons reports filed months or years ago, all looping as if their final moments had been trapped in the wires and left there to rot. The fog thickened until the world beyond the windshield became a blank, depthless wall, so close the light bounced back at me in a dull white glare that made it feel like I was driving inside a coffin lined with frost. I kept my foot steady on the brake, listening to the hiss of static pulse in my ears when something nudged the rear bumper. Gentle, deliberate, just enough to rock the cruiser as though a hand had pressed against it from behind. I checked the mirrors, but there was nothing except swirling pale air folding in on itself. The radio stuttered, cut out, and for a few long seconds there was only the muted thump of my heartbeat in that sealed-off silence. Then the static tightened into a single sound, a word shaped inside the interference, faint yet unmistakable. My own name, spoken as if it had been waiting inside the fog long before I ever arrived. The fog thinned just enough for the silhouette of the forest to rise on both sides, dark and unmoving, when a sudden impact tore through the quiet, metal folding in on itself, glass bursting outward, the kind of violent crash that hits before the mind can register direction. I slammed on the brakes, the cruiser shuddering beneath me, and stared ahead into the trees, waiting for the firelight glow of an engine or the shape of a wreck thrown across the road. Instead, there was only stillness, broken by the distant echo of that impossible collision replaying in my ears. I stepped out, the cold cutting sharper than before, and followed the sound's afterimage into the brush until a car emerged from the gray. A sedan crushed as if it had rolled end over end, roof caved, doors twisted, windows shattered. But as I moved closer, the damage smoothed itself into something impossible. The metal was untouched. The glass lay whole. The car sat pristine, asleep under a skin of dew. No impact, no accident. No reason for it to be here at all. A chill crawled up my spine as I backed toward the cruiser, and that was when I heard them. Footsteps circling the vehicle, slow and heavy, each one settling into the wet pavement as though something unseen and weighty pressed down with careful intent. I swung the beam of my flashlight toward the sound, catching only the mist scattering from its glare. The steps stopped instantly, but the pavement didn't. The water pooled in the tire ruts trembled, sinking inward as if something continued to press on a spot just beyond the light's reach, pushing the ground down one quiet inch at a time. I climbed back into the cruiser, fingers stiff from the cold, and called for backup with a steadiness I didn't feel. The reply came instantly, but it wasn't dispatch. It was my own voice, played back with a thin, trembling breath woven through every word, as if the recording had been made in a room with no air left in it. I tried again, quieter this time, speaking just above a whisper, and a few seconds later the radio answered with the same whisper, delayed and frayed at the edges, mimicking each sound I made with a rasp that didn't belong to me. The cab felt smaller with every repetition, the air thickening until each inhale tasted like cold metal and damp leaves. Then I noticed the forest. On both sides of the road the trees pulsed softly, shadows swelling and shrinking in a rhythm too slow to be wind. It was breathing. The whole line of trunks inhaled and exhaled in shallow, synchronized motions, like lungs straining under a great weight. I stared ahead, forcing the cruiser to inch forward, and through the wavering fog, a shape resolved into view. Another patrol car, identical to mine. Same model, same bumper dings, same small crack in the left taillight. It sat dead on the shoulder with its lights off, its windows black, its engine frosted with cold. And for a moment, I could swear thin threads of vapor leaked from its vents. Soft, steady breaths rising from a place where no living thing waited inside. I left the cruiser behind, the dead twin still sitting in the fog like a discarded thought, and moved toward the tree line with the desperate hope that something, anything, would break the pattern of vanishing roads and echoing breaths. The forest felt close even before I stepped into it, the branches leaning inward as if they had been waiting for someone to cross that boundary. I walked slowly, expecting to see the asphalt stretching behind me whenever I glanced back, but the road was already dissolving into the gray, swallowed one quiet inch at a time. The last shimmer of painted lines sank beneath a tide of darkness, replaced by swaying shapes that weren't quite trees and shadows that didn't match the angles of my flashlight. I pushed deeper, counting my steps to keep my thoughts from unraveling, but something inside the fog matched each number with a soft, deliberate tread of its own. Every time I paused, it paused. Every time I shifted my weight, it shifted just a second later, as though mimicking me with a slight delay, studying the rhythm of my movements, waiting for a moment when my light would flicker, when my breath would break, when my attention would slip for even a heartbeat. In the spaces between my footfalls, the forest seemed to lean closer, the air colder, the ground softer, as if the fog was deciding how much of the path behind me needed to disappear next. And somewhere ahead, through the shifting white, something moved. Not toward me, not away, but sideways, tracing a slow arc as if closing in from an angle I couldn't see. The dispatch center hummed with the low, constant drone of fluorescent lights, the only sound in the empty office. He settled into his chair, the routine familiar. Phones ringing, radios crackling, papers stacked neatly across the desk. At first, it felt ordinary, almost comforting, until he caught a glimpse of himself in the glass partition. His reflection lingered a fraction too long, movements delayed, as if observing him with patience. A subtle unease crawled along his spine, the quiet stretching longer than it should, and he realized the reflection was not just following, it was waiting. The reflection began to move before he did, anticipating gestures and predicting the calls that would come through. A phone rang, and the reflection spoke the words first. Perfectly timed, perfectly clear. Chairs shifted slightly. Papers realigned themselves while he wasn't looking, subtle but deliberate. His own movements lagged behind, mirrored yet off-kilter, like a copy with its own mind. The tension in the room thickened, the office seeming to hold its breath, aware of him, alive, and silently observing everything he did. Pens rolled across the desk as though pushed by invisible hands. Papers shuffled into precise stacks, undoing his own careful organization. The reflection mimicked his growing panic, but always with a delay, deliberate and almost intelligent. The phones rang again, carrying his own voice issuing commands he had never spoken. Each sound, each movement, made him question whether he was being manipulated, or if his mind had begun to fracture under the weight of the night. Reality and reflection were no longer separate. They were entwined, a mirror he could not escape. The reflection gestured toward something he could not see, warning him of dangers just beyond the glass. Every call seemed anticipated. Every sound echoed before it happened. Time warped, repeating itself or dragging, disorienting him with a rhythm he could not follow. The boundary between himself and the reflection blurred. The office no longer felt like a safe space. He was trapped in uncertainty, unsure if he moved or if he was merely being moved, if he existed, or if the reflection was claiming existence for itself. Sunlight began to creep into the office, softening the edges of the fluorescent glare, but the reflection continued its own independent rhythm. Movements no longer aligned. He could no longer tell which were his, which belonged to the glass. The phones repeated distorted fragments from the night, voices familiar and alien at once. By the time morning fully arrived, he sat in silence, unable to distinguish reflection from reality, trapped between worlds, wondering if the office or the reflection had been real all along. The reflection began to move before he did, anticipating every gesture with unsettling precision. A phone rang, and the reflection spoke the words first, perfectly timed, almost taunting him with knowledge he didn't yet have. Chairs shifted slightly when he looked away, papers realigning themselves into patterns he hadn't made. Each step he took felt mirrored, lagging just behind the reflection as if it were watching and learning, calculating. The air in the office thickened, heavy with an almost tangible awareness. And a creeping tension wound around his chest, the quiet whispering that the room was alive. And it was aware of him. Pens rolled across the desk as if guided by invisible hands, and papers shifted into precise stacks that erased his own careful organization. The reflection mirrored his growing panic, delayed just enough to suggest awareness, deliberate intent. The phones rang again, carrying his own voice, crisp and commanding, issuing orders he had never spoken. Each subtle movement of objects, every whisper of sound, made him question whether the station was manipulating him, or if his mind had begun to fracture under the weight of the night. The boundary between himself and the reflection blurred, leaving him uncertain which was real and which was a creation of the glass. The reflection moved on its own, gesturing towards something he could not see, warning of a danger that seemed to hang just beyond the glass. Every call came through before it happened. Every sound echoed with an impossible precision that made his head spin. Time warped around him, stretching and repeating, events lagging in a rhythm he could not follow. The office no longer felt solid, familiar, or safe. He could no longer tell where he ended and the reflection began, trapped in a space that bent reality itself. A mirror claiming him inch by inch until he was unsure if he existed, or if the reflection already had. Sunlight seeped into the dispatch center, softening the harsh glow of the fluorescent lights, but the reflection continued its own rhythm, moving independently of him. He could no longer tell which gestures belonged to himself and which were claimed by the glass, each motion a puzzle he could not solve. The phones repeated distorted fragments from the night, voices familiar yet alien, reciting commands, names, and warnings that made his skin crawl. By the time dawn fully broke, he sat in silence, chest tight, mind fraying, unable to distinguish reflection from reality. The office felt alive, patient, waiting, and he realized with a cold certainty that the night had not ended. He was trapped between two worlds, neither fully his own.